Miriam Coates was 43 years old and owned nothing but the clothes on her back, a pair of worn leather boots, and 9 silver dollars folded into the hem of her skirt. The man who had cast her out, her own brother-in-law, Chester Vance, who had convinced the town council that she was unfit to manage the family trading post after her husband's death, had done his work well. By spring of 1887, no respectable merchant in Ridgemont would hire her, no landowner would lease her ground, and even the boarding house keeper had turned her away with a grimace and a muttered excuse about not having beds. Chester had spread the story that she was prone to hysteria, that she had mismanaged accounts, that she could not be trusted with anything of value. The truth was far simpler and far more dangerous to him. Miriam had noticed discrepancies in the ledgers, had begun to ask questions about money that did not quite balance, and Chester had decided that her silence was worth the price of her exile. On a Saturday morning in late April, standing at the edge of Ridgemont's dusty Main Street, with nothing in the world to call her own, Miriam made her way to the auction block outside the vacant schoolhouse on Copper Hill Road, the very building that had served the town's children for nearly 30 years before it had been abandoned in favor of a newer structure near the rail depot. When the auctioneer, a bored man named Silas Webb, declared the dilapidated building forfeit for back taxes, she stepped forward with her $9 and bought it outright. The crowd laughed. A woman buying a ruin, a place nobody wanted, a coffin of wood and stone that would rot before winter, and Miriam held the deed in her trembling hands and said nothing at all. But as she climbed those creaking steps for the first time, as the owner, as she passed through the warped door into the musty darkness where children's voices had once risen in lessons and recitation, something whispered to her that she had not made a foolish purchase at all, that behind the chalkboard, sealed in a gap between wall and wood, lay a secret that Ridgemont had buried so deep that even the building itself had become a tomb. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Miriam Coates. If you are watching from a place that feels overlooked, that feels cast aside, tell us in the comments. Your story matters too. Miriam's father had been a school teacher in Pennsylvania, a lean man with ink-stained fingers, and a reverence for the written word that he had poured into his 3 daughters like water into thirsty soil. He had taught them to read before they could write their own names, had shown them how to trace letters in the sand, how to sound out words from the Bible and from the newspapers that came through their small town. Her mother had been a seamstress, a woman whose hands moved with such grace and precision that she could craft a buttonhole so perfect it seemed to have been drawn by compass, and she had instilled in her daughters a different, but equally profound literacy, the ability to read the world not through words, but through observation, through the careful cataloging of detail, through understanding that the smallest things often held the greatest meaning. Miriam had been the middle daughter, old enough to help teach the younger children, young enough to still possess her own hunger for learning, while her sisters had married young, one to a minister, one to a farmer. Miriam had helped her father in his work until she was 25, when Thomas Coates had come to town seeking supplies, and had stayed for 3 weeks talking philosophy and trade with her father. Thomas had been a merchant, a man whose ambition was tempered by kindness, and he had fallen in love, not with Miriam's face, but with the way she could recite passages from Emerson, while simultaneously working through a ledger, finding errors that others had overlooked. He had asked her father's permission to marry her, and they had been wed by her mother's brother in a simple ceremony in the meeting house. They had moved west to Ridgemont, where Thomas had established the trading post, and Miriam had borne 2 children, first a son, Daniel, and then a daughter, Sarah. She had raised them in an atmosphere of books and careful thinking, had taught them that value was not only monetary but moral, that a reputation was like a ledger entry that could never truly be erased. She had helped manage the business from the beginning, had kept records in her precise hand, had noticed every transaction, every supplier, every price. Thomas had depended on her judgment, and the business had flourished. The townspeople had come to know Miriam not as the merchant's wife, but as the person who could be trusted, whose word was as good as currency, whose presence in a room seemed to settle disputes simply by the weight of her fairness. But in 1880, when Daniel was 15 and Sarah was 12, Thomas had fallen ill with a fever that would not break. Miriam had nursed him through the long nights, had bathed his burning skin, had whispered encouragement and prayers, but the illness had stolen him from her over the course of a single terrible month. Her children had mourned, the town had mourned, and Miriam had gathered the pieces of her life and returned to the work of managing the trading post, not out of greed, but out of a deep necessity to maintain what her husband had built, to honor his name, to ensure that their children would have inheritance and opportunity. For 7 years, she had managed alone. She had negotiated with suppliers, had kept scrupulous records, had handled accounts with the same meticulous care her mother had applied to needlework. Her son had shown aptitude for the business, and had begun to apprentice with her. Her daughter had attended school with promise and brightness. The post had continued to prosper, and Miriam had begun to believe that she might navigate this life of widowhood with grace, might build something enduring for her children. Then, in 1887, Chester Vance had arrived in Ridgemont. Chester was Thomas's younger brother, a man who had drifted through various occupations without distinction, a failed prospector in Colorado, a gambling man in Kansas City, a man with expensive tastes and empty pockets. He had come to Ridgemont with a story of reformation, claiming he had left behind his wild years and wanted to settle, perhaps to help manage his brother's business, since he had heard it was thriving. He had been charming in those early weeks, had asked intelligent questions about the post, had seemed interested in Miriam's methods and wisdom, but charm had been a mask, and beneath it had been a hunger, not just for money, but for control, for the authority that should have been his, if only Thomas had lived longer, or if only he were the sort of man people could trust. Miriam had first noticed the discrepancy on a Thursday in March. She had been reviewing the quarterly accounts, preparing a report to discuss with Daniel, when something had troubled her, a payment to a supplier for goods that had never been received, a price significantly higher than usual. She had checked the ledger entry in Chester's hand, had looked at the corresponding receipt, and had found the receipt to be a forgery. She had kept her discovery to herself, had checked again, had found 3 more such entries, each one clever enough that a careless bookkeeper might have missed it. When she had confronted Chester privately, showing him the ledger, she had expected him to confess, to beg forgiveness, perhaps to claim he had merely borrowed against future earnings and meant to repay it. Instead, he had smiled, a smile empty of shame, and had told her that the problem was hers, not his. He had told her that he had spoken to the town council about her methods, had suggested that a widow's hysteria and confusion had led to mismanagement, that the discrepancies were the result of her aging mind, her inability to handle the pressures of business, that perhaps it was time she retired. He had been convincing, because he had prepared his ground carefully. He had spent weeks suggesting to townspeople that Thomas's widow was not the sharp woman she had once been, that her son was too young to manage properly, that Chester, as family, should take control for the sake of the community's interests. The council had stripped her of her position within a week. By the time Miriam understood what had happened, it was too late for defense. Her son had wanted to fight, had wanted to take legal action, but Chester was now poised as the interim manager, and the council supported him. More damaging still was that no one had believed her version of events. The town had accepted Chester's story, partly because men's voices carried more weight in matters of commerce, partly because it was easier to believe a woman had failed than to contemplate that they had been deceived, partly because Chester had been generous in his early weeks, buying drinks at the saloon, making small loans to key council members. Within 3 weeks, Miriam had lost her position, her authority, and her ability to earn. The post had become Chester's domain, and though Daniel had worked there still, his mother's name was no longer spoken in connection with its success. Worse, Chester had begun a whisper campaign about her reputation. He had suggested that she had wanted to control her son, that she had been unfit as a mother, that her hysteria extended to her children. He had done this so skillfully that when Miriam's daughter Sarah had begun to receive fewer invitations to social gatherings, when the school had gently suggested that perhaps boarding with a distant cousin might be better for her opportunities, no one had acknowledged that they were responding to rumors. By May, Sarah had been sent away to a cousin in Philadelphia, a separation that had broken Miriam's heart in a way she had not thought possible after losing her husband. Her son had stayed, had tried to continue working at the post, but the tension between him and Chester had grown unbearable, and finally Daniel had made a choice to leave, to seek work in Denver, to escape the poison that Chester was spreading through their family. Miriam had watched her children leave Ridgemont in the space of 2 months, and she had stayed because leaving felt like admitting defeat, like allowing Chester to erase her completely from the place she had called home. She had taken in sewing. She had worked for the hotel, changing linens and scrubbing floors. She had saved every penny with the discipline of a woman who had learned early that value could not be wasted, that each coin represented not just currency, but survival. And by April of 1887, she had accumulated exactly $9, enough to buy the one thing in Ridgemont that no one wanted, the abandoned schoolhouse that stood empty on Copper Hill Road like a monument to better days. She had climbed those steps on her first evening of ownership as the light was turning gold, and the moment her hands touched the desk where the children's compositions had once been read aloud, something shifted in her. The building was hers. No one could take it from her. No matter what Chester had done, no matter what the town believed, this space belonged to her now. And within these walls, she might begin to build something that had nothing to do with the trading post, with Chester Vance, or with anyone's judgment of her worth. She had swept dust and cobwebs, had opened the high windows to let in air, had moved through each room with the reverence of a woman entering a cathedral. And when she had reached the front of the room, when she had approached the large chalkboard that still hung on the wall, a chalkboard where the alphabet had been written by countless small hands, where the evening's lessons had been drafted in chalk dust, she had stood for a long time, simply looking at it. She had placed her palm flat against the wood frame, and she had felt, through the sensitive tips of her fingers, a slight irregularity, a gap where the frame did not quite meet the wall. Her father had been a carpenter as well as a teacher. He had taught her to notice such things. With a butter knife from the hotel dining room that she had borrowed, Miriam had worked at the gap, carefully, patiently, and after nearly an hour, the backing board behind the chalkboard had come free, and there, in a sealed envelope yellowed with age, had been a ledger written in a handwriting she recognized immediately, though it had been more than 30 years since she had last seen it. It was her father's hand. Miriam had sat down on the floor of that abandoned schoolhouse with the ledger on her lap, her hands shaking, and she had opened it to the first page, dated 1854, the year before she was born. What she read had taken her breath away, and in that single moment, sitting in the dust and silence of the empty room, she had understood why the schoolhouse had truly been abandoned, why the town council had been so eager to sell it for back taxes, why this building had become a place that Ridgemont tried to forget. The ledger was not a lesson book or a record of the school. It was an account of every child who had attended her father's classroom during the years he had taught in Ridgemont before moving to Pennsylvania, and beside each child's name were careful notes about their learning, their progress, and, most crucially, something else, a record of payments made to the town council and to specific families, payments recorded as discretionary compensations, with cryptic notes about arrangements regarding colored students and maintaining community peace. Her father had documented the corruption and bigotry of Ridgemont's early years with the precision that had defined his life. He had seen injustice and had recorded it, had written down names and dates and amounts, had documented how the town had extracted fees from the families of black children if they wished their children educated, how funds had been siphoned away by council members, how a schoolhouse had been built partially with these stolen monies, and then, when the shame of such practice had become clear, and the conscience of certain townspeople, perhaps her father among them, had begun to rebel against it, had been quietly hidden, and eventually allowed to fall into disrepair. The schoolhouse was not just abandoned, it was buried, a physical representation of a truth that Ridgemont had wanted to forget. And her father, unable to speak his condemnation openly, in a world that was not ready to hear it, had sealed his knowledge away, had left it as evidence, perhaps hoping that someday it would be found and seen and reckoned with. Miriam had read by the last light of evening, and then by candlelight, and she had not slept that night. She had understood several things simultaneously: that her father had been a man of profound moral courage, that the town she lived in was built partly on the theft of dignity and opportunity, that the schoolhouse had been closed not because it was old, but because it was a witness to shame, and that she alone now held the power to speak what Ridgemont had silenced. She had understood also that this discovery, this secret behind the chalkboard, was not an accident. She had been meant to find it. The world had broken her to make room for this purpose. In the weeks that followed, Miriam had worked methodically. She had kept the ledger hidden, had told no one, had continued her work at the hotel and her work in the schoolhouse itself, which she had begun to clean and restore with her own hands. She had repaired window panes, had swept and scrubbed, had mended the desks, and all the while she had been thinking, planning, understanding what she needed to do. She had written letters to the State Historical Society, inquiries about old records, questions about how injustices might be documented and preserved. She had made careful copies of certain entries from her father's ledger, keeping the original sealed and safe, and she had begun to draft a statement of her own, a narrative that would explain what her father had found, what it meant, and what reckoning might look like. But before she could act, before she could take her findings to the press in Denver, or to anyone who might listen, Chester Vance had discovered what she was doing. He had come to the schoolhouse on a late June evening, had seen the light in the windows, and had entered without knocking. Miriam had been sitting at one of the desks she had restored, a copy of her father's ledger open before her, and the moment she had seen Chester's face, had seen the recognition dawn there, she had known that her careful plan had been compromised. Chester had not been foolish. He had kept asking questions about what she was doing, where she was spending her time, and finally someone, a girl from the hotel, or perhaps a council member, had told him about the schoolhouse, about how the widow Coates had been seen there day after day, about how she seemed to be restoring it, about how she had been asking strange questions about the town's history. Chester had put pieces together that he should never have been able to reach, and now he stood in the doorway of that schoolhouse, with his mouth twisted in anger and calculation. "What are you doing with that?" he had demanded, pointing at the ledger. Miriam had not answered immediately. She had closed the ledger carefully, had stood slowly, and had met his eyes with the same steadiness she had always shown him. "I am doing what my father could not do," she had said quietly. "I am bearing witness." Chester had come toward her then, had tried to take the ledger from her hands, and Miriam had twisted away, had held it to her chest. He had been strong, but she had been desperate, and in the struggle he had struck her, not a blow she could not recover from, but a blow that nonetheless, and his rage had been the final proof that he understood what this ledger meant. He had understood that if the record became public, if the town's founding corruption was exposed, it would implicate everyone: council members, families who had benefited from the stolen funds, perhaps even the business interests that had grown from this poisoned soil. He had threatened her then, had told her that if she spoke, he would ensure she was committed to an asylum, that he would have her declared unfit, that her son would be brought back and made to testify against her, that she would spend the rest of her life in an institution, alone and discredited. He had left her there, shaken, but unbroken, and he had gone to town to set wheels in motion to silence her. But Miriam Coates had not survived 7 years as a widow, had not endured the loss of her children and her livelihood, had not taught herself to read the world through both words and observation, only to be defeated by fear. She had made her copies, had sealed the originals carefully, and she had posted them that very night to 3 addresses: the editor of a major Denver newspaper, her brother-in-law, who was a lawyer in Philadelphia, and the Historical Society. She had written a full explanation, had documented everything she had discovered, and she had waited. The response had come within 2 weeks. First, the newspaper had published a preliminary account, noting that new historical documentation had emerged regarding misconduct in Ridgemont's founding years. Then, the State Historical Society had sent an official inquiry, requesting the original ledger and any supporting materials. Finally, her brother-in-law had written to tell her that he had been contacted by the society and that the evidence was substantial enough to warrant an investigation. And through it all, Chester had tried to discredit her, had brought his accusation of hysteria to the council again, had attempted to have her removed from Ridgemont. But the moment the story had appeared in the Denver newspaper, the town's response had shifted. The same people who had believed Chester's lies had begun to understand that his denials looked suspiciously like shame, and suspicion had turned into investigation. Investigation had turned into exposure, and exposure had turned into something that Ridgemont could not escape. What followed was not a legal trial. There were no laws specific enough to prosecute men so many decades after their crimes. But there was a reckoning. The State Historical Society had arrived to interview townspeople, to examine records, to document the pattern of corruption that her father had witnessed. Families whose ancestors had participated in the scheme had to confront what their inheritance was built upon. The town council had been forced to acknowledge the schoolhouse's history, to cease pretending it was merely abandoned, to begin the process of recognizing Ridgemont's complicity in exclusion and theft. Chester Vance, his reputation in tatters, had left town within a month, running toward a future as empty as his conscience. The trading post he had stolen from her had been seized to settle damages to the descendants of the families who had been exploited. Miriam had signed it over without hesitation. And Miriam, the woman who had been cast out and shamed, had become the keeper of her town's conscience. The State Historical Society had taken her father's ledger as part of their permanent collection, had recognized it as a singular historical document, and they had asked Miriam to work with them as a consultant and interpreter. They had paid her a modest salary, had published her own account of her father's courage and her own role in uncovering what had been hidden, and most importantly, they had authorized her to transform the schoolhouse itself into a historical site, a museum dedicated to documenting the real story of Ridgemont's founding, including the ways in which the town had wronged the people it had claimed to teach. Miriam had worked tirelessly to make the schoolhouse into something more than a sepulchre of shame. She had made it a place of education and reckoning, had arranged for descendants of the wronged families to be invited to share their family stories, had curated exhibits about the history of education and exclusion in the frontier territories, and had ensured that her father's name was honored alongside his courage. The building that Chester Vance had wanted to leave forgotten had become a lighthouse in Ridgemont, a place where people could confront difficult truths, and where the act of bearing witness, of refusing to forget, had become sacred. When her son Daniel had heard the news, he had returned to Ridgemont, and he had thrown his arms around his mother, and wept not from shame, but from pride. When her daughter Sarah had read the newspaper account in Philadelphia, she had asked her cousin to help her write a letter, expressing her own anger at the injustice done to her mother, and she had asked if she might return home. Miriam had welcomed them both, not as a broken woman needing salvation, but as a woman who had saved herself through the simple refusal to accept that her worth could be measured by anyone else's judgment. The schoolhouse that she had bought for $9, the money that had been all she possessed, had given her everything back: her dignity, her purpose, her community, her children, and her vindication. But more than this, it had given Ridgemont something precious and necessary: the chance to know itself truly, to face its failures, and to begin the long, essential work of becoming better. She had looked into the face of corruption and injustice, and she had not looked away. She had held up a mirror that reflected not beauty, but truth, and she had not flinched from what the glass showed. The $9 that had seemed like the last desperate gesture of a ruined woman had proven to be the cost of restoration, not just of her own soul, but of her town's conscience. She had paid $9 for a schoolhouse, and behind the chalkboard, she had found the weight of the past, the depth of her father's moral courage, and the strength within herself that had been there all along, waiting only for the moment when she would be broken enough, desperate enough, and clear enough in her purpose to become unbreakable. This is the story of what we remember when we are pushed to the margins. This is the story of what we find when we refuse to accept that our lives are finished. This is the story of Miriam Coates, who bought nothing but found everything, who inherited not money but truth, and who understood that some investments can never be measured in dollars, only in the quiet, permanent restoration of dignity to those who had been told they were worthless. Her father had written in darkness, believing no one would ever read his words. Her son had abandoned his hometown, believing it was forever corrupted. The townspeople had assumed the schoolhouse would rot unwitnessed. But Miriam had believed something different. She had believed that truth waits to be found, that integrity can be sealed away but never destroyed, and that sometimes the smallest gestures of defiance, buying what no one else wants, reaching behind a chalkboard, refusing to be silenced, can echo across generations and reshape a world. She lived out her remaining years in Ridgemont, surrounded by the community that had wronged her, and that she, in turn, had allowed the chance to become just. She died at 71, and the town renamed the Schoolhouse Museum the Coates Institute for Historical Reckoning, a name that echoed both her father's integrity and her own. So if you find yourself in a place that has tried to bury you, remember Miriam. If you possess only the smallest coin and it seems like nothing at all, remember that sometimes nothing is the exact vessel into which the world pours meaning. If you have been cast out and shamed, know that your exile might be the beginning of your greatest work. And if you have been pushed to the margins, until you can see the whole truth of your community, its beauty and its corruption, its promise and its failures, understand that you have been given a terrible gift and a profound responsibility to speak, to remember, to bear witness, and to allow the light of truth, no matter how difficult, to fall where it will. Thank you for listening to the story of Miriam Coates, for following her through those quiet months when she believed herself to be nothing, for witnessing with her the discovery that changed everything. If you have ever found unexpected value in something others had discarded, in a place others had forgotten, we would love to hear your story in the comments below. Before you go, we want to ask you something. What is a time when you discovered that your greatest strength came not from what you possessed, but from what you were willing to look at unflinching? We hope that question stays with you. Until next time, stay close.